At least for the next hour or so, you won't be that connected, but you will learn a great deal about what it means. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce the co-master of Pforzheimer House, one thing I forgot to mention, Professor Nicholas Christakis.
Thanks, Jay. All right, well, first of all, welcome. Let me add my welcome to all the other welcomes you've received to come here. It's, I'm sure, rather thrilling, actually, to be here, rather exciting and perhaps a little bit nerve-wracking as well. When people hear that I'm going to be speaking about social networks, they often think that I'm going to be speaking about the online variety, the Facebooks and the MySpaces and so forth. But actually what I'm interested in is the rather more old-fashioned kind of face-to-face networks that we human beings have been making for tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. And I'm interested in how and why we form these networks and what they mean for our lives, how they come to affect us. So first of all, what's the difference between a group and a network? The difference, and so here, for example, might be a group of 100 people. Every dot on the right represents a person. You can have an assemblage of such 100 people. And the difference between a group and a network is that a network, in addition to the constituent individuals, also has ties. It has the connections between the individuals. And there are two kinds of networks. There are artificial or purposeful networks, ones we make deliberately, and natural networks. So for example, here's the simplest kind of artificial network you might imagine, a bucket brigade. We take these 100 people, we add 99 ties. Every guy is connected to the guy on the left and the guy on the right. And when you assemble these people into this simple linear network, the constituent individuals and the group of them become optimized to perform a task. For example, the efficient transportation of water to put out a fire, or debris to empty out a hole. And organizing the people in this way gives them properties they didn't have before, makes them able to do things they weren't able to do before. But what's interesting to me, among other things about human social networks, is that you could take the same individuals and the same number of ties and organize them into a different topology, a different architecture, a different structure, like a telephone tree, which is an old-fashioned technology before we had the internet for letting people know about things like school closures, for example, or impending hurricanes. So this person here would let two people know about the event of interest, and those people would let two people know, and so forth. And the information would spread out rapidly and efficiently through this network. So this organization is optimized for a completely different purpose. In fact, this kind of network can be regarded as archetypical. It's the same kind of network that can be used, for example, in a Ponzi scheme. But now, instead of information starting in the middle and flowing out to the periphery, money starts out in the periphery and flows into the center. But of course, real social networks differ entirely in shape and appearance, and actually nowadays even in size. And in my lab, we began to study these social networks in 2002. Here's a slide of a natural social network illustrating one of our first studies. And we made this slide because we became interested in the obesity epidemic. Now, it had become fashionable over the last 10 or 20 years to refer to obesity as an epidemic. And it's clear that obesity was epidemic in one meaning of the word, which is that there was more of it than there used to be before. But we wondered whether we could understand obesity as epidemic in another meaning of the word, meaning that there was something literally spreading from person to person, a kind of contagion, whereby weight gain in one person might spread and cause weight gain in other people to whom that first person might be connected. And so my colleague James Fowler and I became interested in seeing whether we could discern evidence for the spread of obesity, for which, in order to understand that, we needed special kinds of data and special methods to study. So this shows 2,200 people in the year 2000 from a data set known as the Framingham Heart Study. Every dot is a person. Every line between them represents a relationship between the two people. And here we make the dot size proportional to people's body mass index. So bigger dots are bigger people. And in addition, we color the dots according to how big the person is. So if their body mass index is above 30, if they're properly clinically obese, we also color the dots yellow. And if you look at this image, you might be able to see that there are clusters of obese and non-obese individuals within the network. But the complexity is still very high, visually speaking. And in any case, several questions are raised by such clustering, even if you see it. For example, how much clustering is there? Is there more clustering than simply due to chance? How big are the clusters? What is the radius of the clusters? And finally, and most interestingly, I would argue, what might cause the clusters? What are some causal or what are some explanations for why these clusters might exist? Well, first we have to document the existence of the clusters, and we used a variety of methods borrowed from statistical physics in order to do this. So here this shows some of those results. On the y-axis is the increase in the probability that a person is obese given that a social contact of theirs is obese. And on the x-axis is the degrees of separation. And what this slide shows is that if your friends are obese, you've got about a 45% higher likelihood of being obese yourself. If your friends' friends are obese, you've got about a 25% higher likelihood. If your friends' are obese, you've got about a 10% higher likelihood. And it's only when we get to your friends' at 4 degrees of separation that there's no longer a relationship between that person's body size and your body size. So if I knew nothing else about you, then the body size of this person who's almost certainly a stranger to you, your friend's friends or your friends, I would be better able than chance to predict what your body size is. And in fact, this observation holds for lots of other traits, not just obesity, which I'm using now initially as a way of illustrating a broader set of ideas. So this type of analysis shows us 2 things. First of all, it shows us that the clustering is more than would be expected due to chance. There's more clustering than you might expect. And second, that it spreads to 3 degrees of separation. The radius of the clusters is just out to 3 degrees. But it doesn't tell us why. Well, there are 3 possibilities for why we might have this clustering. One idea is a kind of induction effect. So here the idea is a kind of social domino effect. As your friends gain weight, it makes you gain weight, and then you spread it to your friends, and it kind of spreads downstream. A second possibility is homophily, or birds of a feather flock together. Here the idea is it's not that my weight gain caused Jay's weight gain, rather it's that Jay and I formed a tie to each other because we had a similar body size to begin with, or similar interest in exercise, or other attributes that might predict our body size. And last is the possibility of confounding. Here the idea is that maybe something else is happening in the environment, like a gym opening up nearby, that makes me and Jay both lose weight, or something else like a fast food joint that makes us both gain weight at the same time. So it's not that my weight gain causes his weight gain, nor that we form ties with each other because we share attributes, but rather that a third exogenous, so-called confounding factor causes us both to be this way. My fault, for sure. And we used a variety of strategies to sort this out. So what I didn't tell you about our data is that we had longitudinal data where we had repeated measures on these people across time. And I'm about to show you a little 30-second video animation that took about $1 million and 5 years of my life to make. And and my children say that on a per-second basis, it's much less interesting than Avatar and much more expensive, and they're right. Because when we started this work, we had this fantasy borrowed from the experiment that many of you did in high school physics, which is, you probably remember this experiment where you had a water table and you would drop marbles or pebbles on the water table from a particular height, and if you did it just right, the waves would spread out and hit the perimeter, and they would bounce back, and you could get like an interference pattern on the water table, a kind of a standing wave on the surface of the water. So what James and I wondered was whether we could find sort of patient zero of the obesity epidemic. That first person to gain weight, and as they gained weight, it would spread out and cause their friends to gain weight and their friends' friends. Could we see these waves of obesity within this social fabric? If we imagine social networks as being a hyperdimensional sort of socio-topological surface, which they are, could we discern evidence for waves in this surface, whereby something that happens to me spreads out and affects other people, rippling through the network? Now this video I'm about to show you, this 30-second, it's real data, was both the most exciting and the most depressing moment of my scientific career. Because as I told you, we spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to actually get to the point of making this video. It took about 1.5 years to get the grant, and about 2 years to get the data set built, and another year or so to get the statistical analyses to work, and about 6 months to get the visualization software to work. And so 5.5 years after we started, James and I are looking at this video, side by side, waiting to see whether we can see evidence of waves of obesity. And I want you to tell me, truthfully, whether you see it or not. So again, every dot is a person. Every line between them is a relationship between the two people. And here we only show non-genetic relationships. So the gray lines are spousal connections, who's married to who, and the purple lines are friendship connections, who is whose friend. We make the dot size proportional to people's body mass index again, and we color the dots yellow if people's BMI is above 30. And in a minute, I'm going to put this network into motion. We're going to take daily cuts through the network. This is real data over 32 years, every single day evaluating if there's any change in the network, who's whose friend, who's whose spouse, and what their weight status. Also, you're going to see people get bigger and smaller. You're going to see dots appear as they're born and disappear as they die. You're going to see relationships form and end. You're going to see marriages and divorces and friendings and defriendings. These are real defriendings, not like Facebook defriendings. And I want you to tell me whether you see a kind of wave of obesity. So here we are in 1971, a tremendous amount of complexity as people kind of resort their friendships and so forth. There are about 2,000 people in this network, real data across time. You're going to see mostly a sea of yellow now because this is the peak of the epidemic in the United States. Most of the dots are going to be turning yellow. This woman here is going to gain a lot of weight now and move to the middle of the network. You're going to see clusters that towards the end, we're reaching the end now of the time frame. You know, that person there popped up all of a sudden. And you're going to see a lot of sort of some clusters here towards the end of obese and non-obese individuals in the network. Did you see a wave, however, of obesity? Yes or no? We were so depressed because we didn't see the wave either. And it took us a whole day before we could figure out the reason why we didn't see this wave. Does anyone have any ideas? Why might the wave not be apparent in this visualization? I'll take questions again at the end, but it's hard for you guys the first day. Well, because the proper metaphor, because obesity is not a unicentric epidemic, it's a multicentric epidemic. And the proper metaphor is not a single pebble being thrown on the surface, but a whole handful of rocks being thrown on the surface. And every rock falling on the surface, plunk, 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 makes these waves, but the waves spread out from this multicentric epidemic and interfere with each other. So you get a choppy surface, a choppy surface. And so what's happening when you look at this thing is you see this kind of chop in the system. So you need a different set of statistical tools in order to discern these effects, in order to uncover these waves. Now, we used a variety of techniques to study these networks. Incidentally, when we began to make images like this, it began to change my way of seeing the world. I began to think of human beings as a kind of superorganism, like fungi, actually, or ants. Because when you look at these networks, they kind of have a coherence and a kind of life that transcends the constituent individuals, right? These things look like living, breathing entities, these networks. They change, they have a memory, they evolve, they have collective properties that are not present in the individuals, and so forth. We'll come back to that. Anyway, we used a variety of statistical techniques to put these networks under the microscope, so to speak. And one of the tricks that we exploited was the directionality of friendships. Now, let's say that I say that Jay is my friend. Jay could reciprocate the nomination, and we're going to call that a mutual friendship, okay? I say Jay is my friend, Jay says I'm his friend. Or I could say that Jay is my friend, and Jay might have no idea who I am. That was my experience in high school. I thought all these people were my friends, and nobody knew who I was. We're going to call that an ego-nominated friendship, okay? I'm the ego, Jay's the alter, okay? And last, Jay might nominate me as his friend, and now I don't know who he is. We're going to call that an alter-nominated friendship, okay? Mutual friendship, ego-nominated friendship, alter-nominated friendship. In which of those three do you think that Jay's weight gain is going to be most likely to cause my weight gain? Mutual, right? We're close buddies, we pay attention to each other, and so forth. I should be calling him Dean Harris since he introduced me as Professor Christakis, but actually I've known him for a long time. So anyway, okay, and in which one next do you think would his weight gain most likely cause my weight gain? Ego. I nominate him, right? And last, if at all, the alter-nominated friendship, because now he says I'm his friend, but I have no idea who the hell he is. He's gaining weight willy-nilly, but I'm unaware of it. Now, the reason this is important is that if you can disarticulate, if you find this pattern, it helps exclude the possibility that something else is happening in the environment, like a McDonald's opening up that's making us both gain or lose weight. Well, not lose weight in the case of the McDonald's, but make us gain weight because the McDonald's doesn't care if I nominate Jay or he nominates me. So if you find this patterning, it's a kind of clue as to the real nature of the effects at hand. And in fact, when we looked at the data, that's exactly what we found. We found that if it was a mutual friend that gained weight in any given time interval, it increased your risk of obesity by nearly 170% in that time interval. An ego-perceived friend had an effect, alter-perceived friends had no effect. We also found that same-sex friendships affected you, but opposite-sex friendships do not. So men gain weight when the men around them gain weight, and women gain weight when the women around them gain weight, but not the cross-gender relationships. We found some effect of spouses and siblings, maybe a hint, again, in the sibling relationship that gender might matter. We found no effect of immediate geographic neighbors, and we found some effect of coworkers, but only if you worked in a small workplace. Now, this is the directional data, as I said, is important for the reason that I mentioned, but it also highlights the kind of social nature of the effects at hand. That plus the gendering. It seems to matter. An insight about how society works and how human relationships works can help us understand what's going on in this process. But there still might be, we still haven't answered what the mechanism of the spread might be. And there are a number of possibilities as to how it is that Dean Harris's weight gain affects my weight gain. One possibility is that the alter's appearance or behavior changes ego's behavior, okay? So here the idea is that Jay says, let's go have muffins and beer for lunch. And that's a terrible combination, but he suggested it, and he's my friend, and so it's cool, so I copy his recommendation, okay? A second possibility is that the alter's appearance or behavior changes ego's expectations or perceptions of norms. Here what happens, here's what spreads from Jay to me is not a behavior, but rather an idea. As his body size changes, it resets my idea about what an appropriate body size might be. Now, headline writers had a field day when this study was published a few years ago. I think in the New York Times, the headline was, are you packing it on? Blame your friends. But what I found really interesting was that the British headlines had a rather different take on it. They said, are your friends gaining weight? Perhaps you are to blame. So I found a very interesting contrast between the American and British perceptions of, culpability, blame, and the world. Now, I want to be very clear that I do not think our work could or should be used to justify any kind of prejudice against people of one or another body size. And this is another thing that was grossly misunderstood. We had death threats after this came out, and people were very angry at us because they thought we were contributing to a stigmatization of people who had one or another body size. Our intent was merely to understand the world, right? To observe what might be happening and to see, could we add an explanation to our understanding of what might be happening in our society? Well, we became excited by this and we started exploring all sorts of other phenomena. For example, we began looking at smoking, and unlike obesity, which has been increasing across time, smoking, except in your generation, in your age group rather, has been decreasing across time. So here now we make the dot size proportional to people's number of cigarettes per day they have. Bigger dots are bigger smokers. We color them yellow if you have more than one cigarette. 1971, most people are smokers and they're uniformly distributed throughout the network. 2001, most people have quit smoking, and if you zero in on different parts of the network and study it mathematically, you can begin to form the visual and ultimately mathematical impression that the smokers appear to occupy structurally different positions in the network than the non-smokers. Specifically, they come to occupy peripheral locations within the network. I should say that understanding smoking is important because it's still the leading preventable cause of death in our society. Nearly 500,000 people die every year from smoking-related injuries, and there's still about 45 million adult smokers in the United States. Now, we can firm up these visual impressions using some statistical analyses. So here on the left, I firm up the thing I told you where the smokers seem to be pushed to the margins of the social network. They seem to occupy peripheral locations. On the y-axis, we have something known as the eigenvector centrality. It's a way of quantifying the extent to which a node is in the middle or on the edge of a network. And on the x-axis, we have the exam number over the 32-year follow-up, so this is time. And you can see that the non-smokers remain roughly equally central across time, and the smokers, as I alluded to before, progressively become less and less central. They get pushed to the margin. But there's something else that's very interesting in the data that can be studied. So there are two facts I can tell you about smoking. First, I already mentioned that smoking's been declining dramatically over the last 30 years, from about 40% smokers to 20% smokers. Second, I'll now tell you that the size of the smoker clusters has remained constant across time. So the degrees of separation in which people cluster in their smoking behavior hasn't changed across time. How can that be? How can we have many fewer smokers, but the size of the clusters is remaining the same as time goes on? Any ideas? Yeah, in the back.
People quit together with their friends.
Exactly right. Whole interconnected groups of smokers quit smoking at the same time, like a flock of birds changing direction. And that in a very deep way, you can study smoking behavior in humans the same way you might study the schooling of fish or the flocking of birds. And you can use some of the same math to do it. And in fact, it might make about as much sense to ask a human, why are you quitting smoking, or why did you start smoking, as it would make sense to ask a stampeding buffalo, why are you running to the left? The buffalo, if he could speak, would say, I didn't choose to run to the left. The whole herd is running to the left. And in fact, when we do that, when we study that phenomenon, that's what we find, and these data are meant to indicate that the mean smoking cluster size has stayed fixed in the observed data, and this is what would have happened if people were quitting at random throughout the network. Well, we became very excited then, and incidentally, other analyses similar to those that we did for obesity began to show this kind of interpersonal effect of smoking behavior like they did for obesity. Well, James and I then became very excited, and we started to use the data for all kinds of purposes. For instance, to look at the kinds of things that people eat, and this is banana eating in the Framingham Heart Study Social Network. So we color the dots yellow if you have more than one banana per day, otherwise red. And if you look at this, you can see a little community of banana eaters living very peacefully next to a community of non-banana eaters within the network. And we also started to look at other sorts of phenomena like human emotions. Now, when humans have emotions like anger or happiness or fear or disgust, we show them. Why? Why do we show our emotions? I mean, it wouldn't be hard to construct an argument from evolutionary biology as to why we have emotions, why it would increase our fitness to experience these emotions. But not only do I have an emotion, but I show it. And not only do I show it, but you can read it. And not only do you read it, but you copy it. There's emotional contagion with which we're all familiar that's deeply rooted in our humanity. And this function of emotions suggests that whatever other advantages emotions offer, they're also a primitive form of communication. Now, we're accustomed to thinking about emotional contagion as fleeting and involving just a pair of people. For example, I gave this lecture not long ago, a few years ago now, in New York City, and I said, you know, like when you're on the subway and the person across the car from you smiles at you, and you just instinctively smile back? And they said, we don't do that in New York City. And I said, well, everywhere else in the world, this is normal human behavior. And in fact, Jane Goodall and other primatologists who've looked at primates show that actually this is a very common behavior, even amongst our primate forebears. When one chimpanzee, for instance, shows the play face, other chimpanzees will copy and show the play face as well. And of course, emotional contagion can be broader still than these little dyadic interactions I just alluded to. For example, there can be punctuated and broad expressions of anger, such as in riots. But James and I wondered whether emotions might spread beyond pairs of individuals. And might they do so in a more sustained way than riots? Could there be a kind of a quiet riot? Could there be a kind of emotional stampede rippling below the surface of human social networks, such that your emotional state would come to depend on not only your roommate's emotional state, which it will, but also upon your roommate's friend's emotional state, and your roommate's friend's roommate's emotional state, and so forth. Maybe emotions spread across network ties beyond pairs of individuals and in a more sustained fashion all the time. In fact, maybe emotions have a collective existence, not just an individual existence. And maybe we should study them sociologically and not just psychologically. So we made what I think is the first network image of human emotions and published it a few years ago now. Now, again, every dot's a person. The round dots are women and the square dots are men. We color the dots now according to how happy people are using some validated measure that others had validated and deployed. The yellow dots are happy people, the blue dots are sad people, and the green dots are in between. And if you look at this network, you can right away begin to see a few observations, which then are firmed up with further statistical analyses. First, you can see clusters of happy and unhappy people within the network, right? You see clusters of blue and yellow individuals. And these clusters also spread to 3 degrees of separation. Second, you can also see that the unhappy people seem to occupy a different structural location within the network. So the blue dots are more likely to be on the edge of the network, and the yellow dots are more likely to be in the middle of the network. Now, because so much of my research agenda is driven by my experience in high school, James and I could not resist, when we had these data in our 40s, finally revisiting a debate that he and I both had, I suppose because we were nerdy, with our parents in high school. And that was, as we would tell our mothers, you know, if I could just be more popular, then I'd be more happy. And our mothers would say, actually, if you became more happy, then you'd become more popular. So we have now the data to adjudicate this dispute between us and our parents 40 years ago. Because we can look across time and see what comes first. Is it being central in the network that makes you happy, or is it being happy that moves you to the center of the network? And it turns out that James and I were right, and our mothers were wrong, that actually if you become more popular, that contributes to being happy. More than being happy contributes to your being more popular. So being in the middle of the network enhances your happiness, it turns out. Now, as we began to study these emotions, it made us begin to think more deeply about the biology and the evolutionary significance of human social networks. This plus the fact that so far I've only been showing you observational data with which it's very difficult to make causal inferences, to be certain that what's happening has to do with causation. So you need other kinds of experiments, ideally, to really be able to nail down what's causing what. We decided we wanted to do some experiments. And these data I'm about to show you are some data collected with college students in Switzerland who are playing games with each other, little economic games. So the students, who are all strangers to each other, were randomly assigned to interact with each other and given a little bit of money, and they played something known as a public goods game. So the four of us who were randomly assigned, we had a kitty. If we contributed to the collective good, the researcher would multiply the contribution so that the group benefited much more than the price that we paid as an individual. But for any given individual, it was always better to be, well, I won't use a common vernacular amongst you students, it begins with D. It would always be better to be a D word and do nothing and not contribute, and then have everyone else, contribute. So, living amongst, being the master of Forsheimer House has exposed me to all kinds of new vernaculars. Anyway, so it's always better to defect. That's the word I was looking for, defect. Always better to be a defector and not contribute and let everyone else be a cooperator. But nevertheless, the group fared better if you contributed. So what would happen is these four strangers would play the game with each other, then a bell would ring and they would be randomly assigned to play with new people, then a bell would ring and they would be randomly assigned to play with new people again. And you can take such data and reconstruct a social network. And you can examine to what extent does the degree to which F was kind to E, how does it affect whether E goes on to then be kind to A? So what we're interested in understanding is not how, if I'm kind to J, does J reciprocate the kindness, which is a direct reciprocity. That's sort of obvious that we might behave that way. Nor are we interested in studying, if I'm kind to Jay, why are you kind to me? You might see, oh, Nicholas is a kind of guy, maybe you'll be kind to me. No, we're interested in understanding, if I'm kind to Jay, does Jay go on to be kind to you, and then you go on to be kind to him, and does kindness spread? Is pay it forward real? Can you find evidence for this in the system? And it turns out, using this experiment, we were able to document just that. What we were able to find is that if Eleni is cooperative and contributes to the collective good in the first round, if Eleni is kind to Lucas, Lucas goes on to be kind to Erica, Erica goes on to be kind to Jay, and Jay goes on to be kind to Brecken. And what's astonishing to me about these results is that we can see the signature of Eleni's kindness to Lucas in Jay's interactions with Brecken, even though neither Jay nor Brecken ever saw or interacted with Eleni or Lucas. Here in an experimentally created network where people are playing the public goods game with each other. And that's distinct, that's spread across the geodesic distance, that's spread through the network, is different than the spread across time, which is that if Eleni is kind to Lucas, he learns to be kind and then proceeds to be kind to Erica and to Lysander and to Bemi and to Sebastian and to Nicholas. So Lucas's behavior persists across time. It turns out if you multiply all the downstream ripple effects in this experiment of each extra dollar given by Eleni to Lucas in the first period, the network functions as a kind of matching grant, doubling the downstream kindness from this contribution. So things spread in networks, and this has been shown for a variety of non-obvious phenomena. I showed you some work on obesity and smoking. We've done other work on drinking, using other data as well, on drinking and drug use. Also, I showed you a little bit of work on happiness. We've done other work looking at loneliness and depression. You just saw some results on altruism. We've done other work looking at divorce and voting and taste behavior, which I'll show you a bit more in a moment, and ideas, how ideas spread in networks. And most of these things seem to spread out to about 3 degrees of separation, though I should emphasize that this is just a rule of thumb. Now, most of you have heard about the notion of 6 degrees of separation, how on average any one of us is connected through a sequence of 6 handshakes to every other person on the planet. That result has been nicely validated not long ago by Duncan Watts and his colleagues using an email experiment. But what we're showing you here is that even though we might be connected to everyone else on the planet by an average of 6 degrees of separation, our influence typically only seems to spread to about 3 degrees of separation. And again, borrowing some models or some ideas from physics, from high school physics, it may be because there's a kind of a friction in the system. You drop a pebble on a water, and the wave doesn't spread out to cover the whole surface of the planet, right? There's friction between the water molecules. The waves peter out at some point. And the same kind of thing can happen with social influence. And I should also emphasize that even though I'm a zealot about networks, not everything spreads, and not everything spreads by the same mechanism. So just because we say that germs spread, or ideas spread, or money spreads, or emotions spread, or behavior spread, doesn't mean that they all spread in the same way. And again, I should emphasize that both good and bad things can spread. But a key idea about networks for this part of the talk that I'd like to emphasize is that networks magnify whatever they are seeded with. Networks magnify whatever they are seeded with. You put anything in a network, it will magnify it. But you must put something in the network. The network doesn't on its own give rise to phenomena. There has to be a hand dropping rocks. The waves don't appear on their own on the surface until something outside the system impinges on the system and gets it going. Well, do things spread online too? Does the online world resemble the offline world, and how is it different? Now, people have multiple ways of interacting. This is some data from a diverse Northeastern university that shall remain nameless. Every dot is a student. Every line between the two students represents a relationship between the two students. And so here are about 105 students who all reside in the same dorm, and here are the connections between them representing whether or not they're friends with each other. And here is whether or not they belong to the same clubs in green, and here is whether or not they're roommates with each other. Now, actually, that's a problem if these two guys are connected because they're roommates, but there's no white line indicating that they're friends. An experience I hope you guys don't have, but which is unavoidable in this kind of a system. And here's what happens when you add Facebook friends in red. Because on average, people have 110 Facebook friends, but only 6 real friends, as we showed at the beginning. And in fact, it's sort of weird to me that Facebook has managed to kind of co-opt a very old and interesting word in our language, namely friend, and apply it where it has no business. All those people, they're not your friends. At best, they're your acquaintances. And in fact, the question becomes, to what extent are we affected by all these tenuous online relationships we might have? And to what extent does the online world function to transmit the effect of real interactions buried among them? Here's what happens when you look at the entire class at this diverse Northeastern university of 1,700 students. You get a network and a level of complexity that's just astonishing. So for both analytical and conceptual reasons, we need a way to discern which of these ties are real old-fashioned friendships. And it turns out that Facebook friends and other online connections are actually quite tenuous. And the question is, do they influence us in the same way as real face-to-face ties? So to discern real friends, about 4 or 5 years ago, we employed some Harvard undergraduates to help us with a research project. We paid them all summer to look at Facebook. And what they did was they looked at Facebook profiles and they coded, we had to do this manually in those days, the extent to which you co-appeared and tagged in photographs. So you might have 100 or 1,000 friends on Facebook, but only for a subset of them do you appear in a photograph with them that you upload on your page and tag. Okay? So we're going to treat those relationships as being different than all your other Facebook friends. And it turns out that on average, people had 6 friendships with which they were tagged, photographs which they were tagged, whereas they had an average, as I said earlier, of 110 Facebook friends. And in addition, we were able to look at whether or not there was a flow of influence in this network. So for example, we looked at a bunch of things, people's taste in books and music and movies. And these are the top 10 movies of this diverse Northeastern university, their top 10 movies, movie tastes of these students. And when we looked at whether one of your Facebook friends expressed an interest in one of these movies, did it affect whether you subsequently were interested in this movie? The answer was no. So if one of your friends said, my favorite movie is, Gladiator, it did not affect the probability that you subsequently would be interested in Gladiator as well. On the other hand, if one of your real friends, buried in your Facebook friends, expressed an interest in one of these movies, it did affect your likelihood of being interested, but only for these 3 movies, Good Will Hunting, Pulp Fiction, and Love Actually. And we could go on then to map the network and see where are these people located in the network, these students. And so the Love Actually fans are in yellow, the Pulp Fiction fans are in red, and the very few fans of both are in orange. And if you look, you can see that the Pulp Fiction fans are located in the middle of the network, and the Love Actually fans are located on the periphery of the network. And the very few fans of both, fascinatingly, are structurally right between where the two regions of the network are. Now, marketers and other people, public health experts and so forth, increasingly think that if we can map human social networks, taking advantage of the kind of online media that you and so many of us are using nowadays, we would have better tools for marketing products and changing health behaviors and so forth. But if you were selling Love Actually, and you thought all I have to do is find the central people who are going to influence others, and you targeted the people in the middle, you'd be out of luck, because these guys are not interested in Love Actually, they're interested in Pulp Fiction. So you need information not only about the network, but also about the attributes of the individuals. And this point, this difference between the effect of real connections versus tenuous online connections was really driven home to me and James about 9 months ago in a very personal way. Because about 9 months ago, Alyssa Milano, who's an actress, I'm assuming most of you know Alyssa Milano. I did not know about her before she did this. She has 1,050,000 Twitter followers. And on this particular day, about a year ago now, last fall, she sent a tweet about our book, Connected, The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives. And in it, she buried a URL, which if you click on that, it took you directly to the Amazon.com website for our book. And this tweet was retweeted about another 1 million times on this day. So on this particular day, 2 million people got a tweet about our book with a link to go to the Amazon.com website for our book. Now, James and I, because we're neurotic, actually follow the sales rank of our book. And on the y-axis, we have the rank, and up high is more sales, and down low is fewer sales. And here is the time period. And here's the day that Alyssa Milano tweeted our book. Actually, we estimate that we did not sell a single extra copy of our book, despite 2 million tweets going out on that day. In fact, some people have looked at these data and suggested that when the tweet went out, people rushed to the bookstore to return the book, which is why the rank went down. Now, and the reason we think is that, in part, and the story is more complex, and if you're interested in all the complications, you can take some of my classes or come and see me at FOHO and we can talk about these things. There's a lot of complexity here that I'm blowing by. But the main reason is that Twitter, whatever good it is at disseminating information, at least for certain kinds of behavior, is not so good at disseminating behavior. Because many of you tweet, I'm sure, you probably don't pay much attention to the tweets, except those tweets of the people who are actually your friends, and vice versa. And those people, in fact, can affect you. Now, while we were looking at the Facebook data, we couldn't resist the temptation to also go back and take a look at the photographs of the people and revisit the happiness study I told you earlier. And so now we coded whether people were smiling in their profile photographs. So the yellow dots are smiley people, and the blue dots are frowny people, and the green dots are in between. And this is a Facebook network, and if you look at this network, once again you see clusters of frowners and smilers in the network. The smiley people are more likely to be in the middle, they're more likely, and they have 20% more friends than the frowners. So this work with emotions, which is so fundamental, and with cooperation, which is also fundamental from an evolutionary biology point of view, got us to thinking about the evolutionary basis of networks themselves. Because human social networks, whenever they have been mapped, always look strikingly similar. So they always kind of look like this. And you guys probably knew that even before today's lecture, because you've come of age in a period where images of human networks are part of popular culture. You see them everywhere. And probably every network you've ever seen of human social networks looks kind of like this. But it never looks like this. Why not? Why don't we humans happen to construct networks that look like a regular lattice? We could have, but we don't. So the striking patterns of human social networks, their ubiquity, and their apparent purpose beg the question of whether we evolved to have networks and to have particular kinds of networks in the first place. So now the intellectual questions become, why do we form networks in the first place, and why do they have the structure that they do? And to understand this, we need to dissect network structure a little bit first. So we need to have a slightly better understanding of what we mean by location within networks. So first of all, notice that every position in this network is isomorphic to every other position, right? So everyone in this network has 8 connections, and every one of their friends has 8 connections. And if you took this lattice and wrapped it around the surface of a sphere, actually more properly wrapped it around the surface of a torus, of a donut, and every position on that surface would be equidistant to the periphery as any other position on the surface, okay? So everyone would be just as central and just peripheral if the network was like that, this type of regular lattice network. But that's not the kinds of networks that we've observed as we've been seeing. In fact, networks look like this. And there are different structural positions within networks. So for example, let's compare individual B and D. B has 4 friends, 1, 2, 3, 4, and D has 6 friends. And B and D are aware of this difference between the two of them. If you talk to people, they're aware of how many friends they have. Some will say, I've got 6 friends. Some will say, I have 4. Some will say, I've got no friends. People know how many friends they have. They're aware of their location within the network with respect to the number of connections they have. But there are other aspects of their position in the network that they're not aware of. For instance, contrast node C in the middle of the network to node D here on the edge. They both have 6 connections. But there's something very different about them. And I can cultivate that intuition in you by asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? C or D? D. You have the intuition that it's better to be D. You're going to be less likely to get what's flowing, and you're going to be less likely to get it early in the course. Now, who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip were spreading through the network? C, unless it's about you. C. Right? So you have this sense that being in the middle of the network might increase the probability with which you acquire information, but also increase the probability with which you might acquire an infection, for example. And now contrast A and B. A and B here on the edge, they both have 4 connections, but you'll notice the difference between A and B is that the friend of A's is back again a friend of A's. So the friend's friend is your friend, whereas your friend's friend here is not your friend. Okay? So now let me ask you, if you were a prehistoric human and you wanted to hunt and kill a mastodon, who would you rather be, A or B? A. You have the intuition that you'd rather be A. All your friends can work together, you can get your crew together, you can go kill the damn thing, all right? Now who would you rather be if the challenge was not to kill the mastodon, but rather to find a mastodon? B. Because in A's case, your friend's friend is your friend. Do you know where the mastodon is? No, do you know where the mastodon is? It just comes right back to you. There's no ability to tap distant information in the network. So all 3 of these traits you see are ways of summarizing positions within the network. And it turns out that all 3 of these traits are heritable. So this is a paper we just published a couple of years ago now, using a twin study design, looking at the extent to which these traits are transmitted. And what we find is that about 46% of the variation in how many friends you have can be explained by your genes. Now that's not too surprising. Most of us are aware of the fact that some of us are born shy and some of us are born gregarious, and so the number of friends you have might be partially explained by your genes. But in addition, we also find some other results which are frankly bizarre. We find that 47% of the transitivity, that's whether your friends are friends with each other, also can be ascribed to your genes. This is really crazy. What I've just told you is that if you have Tom, Dick, and Harry in a room, whether Dick is friends with Harry depends not just on Dick's genes or on Harry's genes, but on Tom's genes. Whether Dick is friends with Harry depends on Tom's genes. How can that be? Well, we think the reason is that people vary in their inclination to introduce their friends to each other. Some of us knit the network around us together, and others of us do not, in a kind of worlds collide theory, keeping our personal life and our work life, let's say, separate. And there may be evolutionary significance to these behaviors. So where you are in this vast fabric of humanity depends in part on your genes. Also, even the centrality, how central you are, 29% heritable. Now, networks affect us in another way as well. It's not just what's flowing through networks, whether people around you are losing weight or gaining or getting happy or watching love, actually, that matters. It's the actual structure of the network around you that also matters. So it's not just social contagion that matters, it's also social connection. Now let me illustrate what I mean by again now invoking high school chemistry. No doubt both of you learned about these objects in high school chemistry. They're both, of course, made of carbon. And the difference between the two is that on the left, you get graphite. You take the carbon atoms and you assemble them one way in these sheets, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Or you can take the same carbon atoms and assemble them a different way in the pyramids as shown on the right, and you get diamond, which is hard and clear. So the intellectual point here are twofold. First of all, these properties of hardness and softness and darkness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms. They are properties of the collection of carbon atoms. They arise once you connect the carbon atoms to each other. First point. Second point, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. So similarly, it's not the ties between people that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. New properties emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. So just like the bucket brigade and telephone tree example I gave you at the beginning, you can take the same people and connect them one way, and that collection of human beings has certain properties that were not properties of the constituent individuals, and also, interestingly, that differ from the properties that would arise if you took those same people and assembled them in a different way. So it's not just what's happening to the people around you, whether they're happy or rich, for example, that matters. It's also the structure of the ties around us that seems to affect our lives. I'll give you one example of this taken from the work of one of my colleagues, and then I'll stop with one last sort of big idea. This is some work done by Brian Utsi, who's a sociologist at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University in Chicago. He became very interested, don't ask me why, in Broadway musicals. And he was very interested in why Broadway musicals were sometimes a success and sometimes a complete failure. And he thought it might have something to do with the structure of the production company, the network structure of the production company. You got the director and the actor and the choreographer and the costume designer and so forth. And he used something very similar to this notion of transitivity that I showed you earlier with the mastodon hunting example. Imagine that you have, this is 5 dots represent, or 6 dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dots, represent a little cartoon of a company that's putting on a show. And you can imagine that this person is connected to the 5 of them, and that these other 5 people, there are 5 times 4 divided by 2, 10 potential ties between all those people. And if all 10 of them are present, 10 out of 10 ties, you would say that this network around this person is 100% dense. And at the other extreme, if none of them are present, there's 0% density. Your friends' friends are not friends with each other. And here you might have an intermediate level. You see you've closed these triangles here, and you might say there's 40% density. And what Utsi did is he plotted the commercial success and critical acclaim of the Broadway musicals, how much money did they make, and how successful were they critically, against the density of the network of the production company. And he found that if nobody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And he found that if everybody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And that optimal performance was achieved if you had intermediate density. Some people knew each other from before, some people brought fresh ideas into the group. So if you really want to hunt and kill a mastodon, you need some people who can find it and some people who can work together to kill it. So let me close with some remarks, some broad sort of intellectual remarks, and then we can take some questions and then you can go about the rest of your day. Because the question remains, at least for me, what is the point of a connected life? How does it help us as individuals and as a species? And it turns out that networks are a resource that we can all use. They're a kind of social capital. Now, most people, when they think about capital, think about money. But really, capital is any stock of resources that can be put to productive use. So capital is a stock of resources that you can do something with. And 2 further key ideas about capital, subtle ideas, are that first of all, in order to create or acquire capital, you have to invest skill and effort. You need to know something and do something to get capital. And second, and this is even more subtle, that in order to create capital, you have to introduce changes in a substance that make it yield a higher rate of return than it previously would yield. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine a forest and a farm. A farm is a stock of wealth. It's a type of capital. By investing skill and effort, by knowing something and doing something, and clearing the land, we convert the forest to a farm. And the farm is more productive, at least of fruits and vegetables and grains. It's not more productive of wood, but it's more productive of the things we want it to. We convert the forest to a farm, and the farm becomes a stock of wealth, a reservoir of wealth, and we pay more for it than we would, let's say, for the forest. Or imagine this idea. Here you take this tree, you invest skill and effort, and you mill it, and you make it into lumber. And you can do things with the lumber you couldn't do with the tree. And this investment of skill and effort and this ability, this potentiality that the lumber has is what makes it a stock of wealth, a stock of capital. For example, you can use the lumber to do something else, like make a violin, which is even more valuable than the lumber because you can do things with a violin you couldn't do with a lumber, namely make music. So at each step of the way, we invest skill and effort, we transmute the substance upon which we are working, and that transmutation is what makes it more valuable, what makes it function as a reservoir of wealth. Now, in the 1960s, spearheaded by economist Gary Becker and by other social scientists, we began to think of human beings this way. So you can take this dissolute former graduate student of mine, who's a drunkard, and you can invest skill and effort, and you can clean him up so that now he's no longer a drunkard, and he's more productive and better able to do things than he was before. You work upon this young man, and you clean him up, and now he's better than he was before. Or you can work upon him still more and give him an education, right? You can change his mind. You change his brain. You guys will be here for 4 years having your brains changed. We are investing a huge amount of skill and effort to achieve this objective. We are working upon the matter that is your cortex and changing it in a way that makes it more productive than it was before, so that when you exit here, you have this reservoir of wealth, which is your education. Now, it turns out that beginning in the 1970s, sociologists such as James Coleman at the University of Chicago began to also think about social capital in this way. Just like physical capital is created by a change in the material world, and human capital by a change in persons, social capital is a change in the relations among persons, a change that renders the group more productive and capable of doing things it was not previously able to do. And social capital can arise in at least two senses from social structure. First, in terms of what is flowing through the group and across the connections. Are you in a network where valuable information is flowing or where Ebola is flowing? Very different. And second, in terms of how the network is organized and what the connections are like. So this is my last slide. This perspective on humans and on social systems has a number of implications. First, as we have seen, we gain insight into how the whole comes to be greater than the sum of its parts. It's the ties between people that make the difference between groups and networks. It's the ties that add value and that lie at the root of the emergence of these new properties that inhere in the collective and not within the individuals. Second, it also means that there can be new kinds of hierarchy in social systems that we've previously not paid much attention to. So we're accustomed to thinking about the black and the white and the rich and the poor and the urban and the rural and the educated and the non-educated and the Harvard and the Yale. Yes, what I was, yes. But the question we can also begin to think about is which networks are people's members of? Where are they structurally in the network? Are they in the periphery or in the center? Do they have many friends or few friends? What kind of subcluster are they members of? Third, this network perspective sheds light, we think, on individuality and free will. Now, this is an old idea in philosophy and in history and in the social sciences. Do we or do we not have free will? And some people have looked at our work and suggested that what we're really doing is subverting the role of free will in human phenomena. That what I've told you today is that your feelings, your body size, your behaviors, your tastes depend not just on your own decisions, but also on what's happening amongst these people you don't even know, these strangers to you. And to a very large extent, that's true, and thereby free will is subverted. On the other hand, it's also true that whenever you make a positive change in your life, when you quit smoking or you improve your study habits or whatever, it ripples out through the network and affects dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of other people. And this observation, you see, increases the salience and importance of free will. And finally, there's a very deep and I believe fundamental connection between social networks and goodness. Because overall, we form social networks, we humans, because the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. Look, if I was always violent towards you, or gave you bad germs, or gave you misinformation, or made you miserably unhappy, you would cut the ties to me and the network would disintegrate. Therefore, the flow of good and desirable things through the network is required to sustain and nourish the network. And similarly and interestingly, the network is required for those good and valuable things. If you think about things that we as humans privilege, like love, or altruism, or happiness, or ideas, they're all connected to our interpersonal interactions with each other. We don't speak about love of yourself so much. We speak of love of others. We don't speak about justice towards yourself so much. We speak about justice towards others. These big ideas that we have about what's important in life are connected very deeply to the fact that we live our lives embedded in human social networks. And if we realized how valuable social networks are and what they are doing for us and what they can do, we'd be the better for it. Because in fact, I think social networks are required for goodness to flourish. Thank you.